So in this video, I'm going to show you how I put together these cabinets. I'm going to show you step by step from the ripping it down to the assembly to everything in between, using 3/4 inch plywood and some basic tools that every woodworker should have. I don't fit all the way. The first thing I did is I brought out this pink insulation to put under my plywood. This is going to allow me to cut my plywood without cutting my work area. If you don't have one of those, it would be a really good idea to get one of those. Then you saw me outline my plywood with a black Sharpie. This is just to let me know which edges I have cut and haven't cut. And then I'm just going to give myself about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch to cut off at the end there, just to give myself a nice clean edge. And then I'll finally start cutting my actual carcass pieces. Mine are going to be 30 inches tall, so I'm going to make those adjustments based on my circular saw. Then I'll bring out my next plywood sheet and I will restart that process. Then I bring my table saw out and I go ahead and rip down to a 23.5 on all sides, except the height, of course. Then always make sure you sand. We're not animals, just sand it a little bit. Make sure you check it for square. Then I cut out my nailer strips. And speaking about sanding, I definitely did not sand those, but if you won't tell, neither will I. Now this is where people tend to overcomplicate things. They, for whatever reason, want to add all these extra fancy clamps and all this stuff. I just use my bare hands and I just hold down my pieces. I flush everything up to the touch. I add a bunch of glue. I add some brad nails, and that's it. Now, I did put myself in the beginner builder mindset. And when I was doing that, I remembered that most of my projects, I would add a bunch of screws, even when they weren't needed. So in order for you to see the rigidity and the difference, maybe, I'm actually gonna go ahead and add a bunch of screws. So once my carcass is built, this is how it would normally go. I would measure for square, and then I would just start painting or staining or whatever. But to give myself that extra rigidity and that extra sturdiness as a beginner would do, I added a bunch of random screws in a bunch of random places. But you really don't have to, depending on what your cabinets are gonna be intended for. Anyway, at some point you should have all your carcasses done. Okay. Now let's figure out our toe kicks. And I don't mean just randomly kicking things with your toes. I mean the toe kicks that are designed so you have a little space while you're working on top of your cabinets or any other whatever. Anywho, typically toe kicks are 3 inches tall and 3 inches inset, which you could just remove it from your plywood before you assemble it, but I don't like to do that. And also, it just, for me, makes it more complicated because of how uneven my floor is. So that wouldn't be something I would be able to do or even want to do, but you can do it if you'd like. I like to make my toe kicks completely separate. And in this case, I can't use the normal 3x3 box that I would do in other cabinetry because of the foundation that sticks out of my wall. The foundation sticks out approximately 1.5 inches. And it's also about 5 inches off the floor. In this case, you see me using my miter saw, but you can also use a circular saw like this. And just for my own sake and sanity, I'm gonna give myself a flat edge. I don't want to overcome more things because my floor is so uneven, right? And as you see with my toe kicks, I do use screws and glue pretty specifically because this is Southern Yellow Pine and it's got some girth on it, as you can see here. And I hate measuring, so usually I use my workpiece to figure out my measurements. So since my wall sticks out 1.5 inches, I add 1.5 inches spacer. The reason I do this to the toe kick and carcass is so I know where to screw in my screws. Screw in my screws. But as you see here, then I know where I'm gonna go ahead and pre-drill some holes. That's gonna tell me where the piece is gonna sit. So then that way I can screw that piece into the other piece. Okay, so for toe kicks, there's two ways to level them out. You can use this method, which is using shims, and honestly it takes freaking forever. But there is another method, and the other method is using little scraps of wood like you see here. You manually adjust your height little by little, starting from the most level to the most unlevel, and you just add a little bit of glue, a little bit of brad nails. So if you don't have a brad nailer, use the shim method. If you do have a brad nailer, use this method. It is much more sturdy because the pieces are integrated to your workpiece. But no matter what, just make sure everything's nice and balanced before you screw everything together, which you see me doing now. I'm not sure how many screws I added, but I probably did 2 in the front, 1 in the middle, and 1 in the back. Once that's all flat leveled, make sure you double check and screw it into your nailer strip so you have rigidity to the wall, and then screw down your toe kick. Now you're seeing me cut my pieces for a face frame. Now I'm going to show you another method where you do not have to use a face frame, but face frames do make everything look pretty. So let's go ahead and make a face frame. All I do is, once my cabinet carcass is all put together, I get my final measurements that way. And then I just put butt joints and glue and brad nails. And then always make sure you bring your workpiece over for your middle face frame. Personally, this is my preferred method, but if you don't want to do that, don't do that. You can measure it out. But you know, math is sometimes kind of hard. So I measure the top, measure the bottom, I make my little lines, and now I know exactly where it's gonna go. I bring out my speed square, I make sure everything's nice and square, and then I just brad nail it together. At the end though, as you see here, I do add quite a bit of glue. Like, I am not shy with the glue at all, mainly because I don't want to put a bunch of brad nails in my workpiece, because then you got a bunch of holes to fill. So I do put a few, and then a few at the top, a few at the bottom, a few on the sides, and then I let it cure. And you'll see, like, I'm gonna show you a method where you don't use these face frames, so you know, it's not a big deal. Okay, so now I'm working on my drawers and my doors. So depending on your cabinets, maybe you want more doors, maybe you want more drawers. Well, good luck, because I'm giving you all the steps. Or I shouldn't say good luck, that sounds kind of rude. I should say, if you need luck, I got you. I got all the measurements for you. Okay, so decide whether you're gonna use these cheap slides or these middle of the road slides. The cheap ones don't have as much adjustability, I've learned, but you know what, man, if that's all you can afford, don't beat yourself up. So get your measurement of how thick your slide is, and then build your drawer around that measurement widthwise. These are 1/2 inch a piece, so it's 1 inch for either one. Anyway, once you build a drawer, I like to use a little offcut, and this is just gonna tell me where I can screw and where I can't. And if you see my drawer bottom, it's not integrated into the workpiece. It's just screwed at the bottom with some glue and some brad nails. Now, if you are gonna use screws, this is the one area where you should use screws, especially for your drawers. I'm doing butt joints, which means there isn't a whole lot holding it together from racking back and forth, so screws are really good for that. Anyway, once you figure out where you want your slides, I always use a spacer, so it's always the same on either side, as you saw in the video. Then I put it in my drawer, I force it in there, I bring it out just a little bit, I pre-drill my hole, I make sure everything's all flush, and then I'll pull it out a little bit more. I'll do both holes at the same time, like the first holes. I'll pull it out a little bit, I'll do the second holes, and then I'll remove the drawer completely and add the third screw. So no big deal. Same thing with the top drawer. I add a little spacer so it doesn't like accidentally get too much friction or anything like that. I do a very small line because that's just how I do things. Then I bring out my speed square and I give myself a parallel line to the frame. And it's the same method. I line up my slide right down the middle. I pre-drill the 3 holes right away, and then I just screw them in. And what you see me doing here is just applying the bottom mount to the drawer. And the nice thing is if you give yourself enough wiggle room, I mean, it's really hard to mess these up. But anyway, before I paint everything, I went ahead and sanded everything. And personally, my preferred method is to paint it once it's together. But I just want to show you different options because truly, I mean, it is what it is. It's your cabinets. You can do whatever you want. You can make them pink. You can make them green. You can make them gray like I did because I'm boring. Anyway, once they're all painted and they're all nice and flush, then I go ahead and screw them into my wall. So I didn't do my holes in this cabinet carcass because I wanted to show you this. I just find a piece of wood that is as close as possible to that width between the edge of the cabinet carcass and the toe kick, and then I use that same piece of wood to draw some lines and I screw it in. Then I reapply my drawers and the drawers are pretty much done. I'm gonna go ahead and assemble my other carcass now. And again, I'm just adding a few screws. It's nothing crazy, but this is where I'm showing you that that's how they would look if you don't do a face frame, if you just painted them. Now you could make your own little thin strips like this. You could use edge banding. You could do all that method. I mean, it's up to you, really. Like, it's really the world's your oyster at this point. But if you do add face frames, always do your doors or drawers with the face frames attached because it's easier to do it that way. But you could do it after, as you see me do in a little bit here. So since this is going to be a door, I gave myself a little bit of that wiggle room. I used my Craig jig to cut out my pieces for my door. Just, it lines up everything really nice. But if you don't have a Craig jig and you don't want to use a European style hinge, then don't use a European style hinge. They sell all kinds of hinges and they're your cabinets. So if you don't want them to look pretty, then don't make them pretty. Just make them functional. That's more important than pretty. But these do need a spacer, so I added that in there. And then here's my method. I know people use playing cards sometimes. I just use index cards. They're cheaper and you could just use them to draw on them later, which you'll see here in a little bit. So I find out my spacing. I make sure that they're equal on all sides. And I'm just gonna make sure that I pull everything up. So it's really, again, your choice, but this is what I believe to be the simplest method. I just line everything up. I pull the door as close as I can to me, and that's where I pre-drill my holes. Now, to add the door handles, I first just figure out where I kind of roughly want the handles. Then I start getting some measurements, being as careful and precise as I can. And you'll see me here, I'm gonna make a little jig to help me out. But basically I'm just lining up the holes and I'm eyeballing center because unless you're really not that great at woodworking, you don't really need a lot of specialty tools. You can kind of make your own. So I just transfer, as you see here, the door handle onto a little index card. And you'll see why this is super important in a second. But if you don't do this, then don't do it. But this is going to make your life a lot easier. And then I just make sure that my index card matches my rudimentary drawing here of where my door handles are going to go. Then I use the same drill bit that I'm going to drill the hole out of, and I put it into the hole and I make sure I wiggle it around, and then I'm very careful, line everything up. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's pretty self-explanatory at this point, I think. But do not throw this index card away because you will need it later. And then just like a test, I fill in the bubbles. That way I know exactly where I'm going to drill. And then I drill it in. See? Easy peasy. Lemon squeezy. I always use that pink insulation so I don't drill into my workbench. And here, I honestly did not measure anything. I just threw a bunch of random holes in there and I just make sure I have the appropriate size screws. For example, this is 3/4 inch plywood that I'm using for my drawers and 3/4 inch plywood that I'm using for my face, because this drawer specifically, more than any other drawer, is going to take a lot of weight. So I just screw it in place using the index card method to give myself a little riser and a little gap. And then here is the index card part. So what I do is I flush up the lines at the very edge, I hold them together, and then I really pinch the back. This, and then I make sure that it's flush and square and parallel. But that allows you to find center really, really quickly. And then I use my level, I put it on top of my piece, I line everything up, and then I just make a little line at the bottom. That's letting me know that that's actually going to be my top. But if you did that at your bottom, you'd be fine. And look, there you go. It's all installed now. Now you move on to your next drawers. So this is an example of something I used to do. I used to just use plywood as my tops. I didn't really have a way of making things flat before, so I would just use plywood, use some edge banding, and call it a day. But you can also use something like melamine, a butcher's block, or other S4S type material, and you can kind of just create your own top that way. Now, if you come back for my future video, I'm actually going to show you how to flatten a lot of different kinds of slabs using handheld tools like a planer.